And Ellen Starr Brinton was our great aunt,
Oh, that's so neat.
our grandfather's sister. His name
That's
was
really cool.
Clement Starr Brinton.
You know what? When I was doing some of the research for this program, I came across, I think, Clement Starr Brinton's obituary in the Philly Inquirer, maybe. If you're looking for like family papers and things online, newspapers.com has a lot of old newspaper clippings and things like that they've digitized. So it's a really great resource right now in the middle of a pandemic.
Could you tell us again, Philadelphia Inquirer?
I believe it's the Philadelphia Inquirer, but you can find all kinds of old newspapers on newspapers.com. Let me pull up the link while we're waiting for a few more people, and I'll send it in the chat.
Hello, I'm Constance. My mother was a Brinton, and I guess I am too. I am in Tacoma, Washington.
Well, thank you for joining us.
I love these webinars. Thank you so much for putting them together.
Of course, no problem. We got to find a way to keep doing the museum, even in the middle of a plague,
Ellen Starr Brinton had several siblings. One was my grandfather, Clement Starr. He was one of the founders of the Food and Drug Administration. Her other brother, Willard Brinton, was the founder of the New York Port Authority. Another, Francis Brinton, was a famous antiques dealer who got most of the antiques for Winter Tour. And then there was Robert Brinton, who was a farmer near Westchester, Pennsylvania. So it was a very dynamic family.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think in our research, the furthest member of the Brinton family we found was a judge who lived in Cairo, Egypt. But it feels like wherever you go in the world, you'll end up encountering a member of the family somewhere.
Yeah, there are a lot of Brintons out west, and they've become Mormons. And
yes, yeah.
I was in Wyoming, and I saw pictures for Brinton, this and that, and they were related to I think it was the Mormons who migrated out there.
Yeah, there were some Mormons. There is I think it's a date, I would have to look up the exact name, but there's a Brinton Museum out west that's connected to the family as well as part of that same movement.
It's the Bradford Brinton Ranch?
Yes, that sounds right. Yeah. I've never been there myself, but I know there's a family connection there as well.
Yeah, it's in the Bighorn Mountains.
Oh, neat.
Yeah.
That'll be a travel destination once the plague is over. All right, so we're at 3:05 and I'm not seeing anyone else jumping in. So we'll get started, and I'll let, if someone jumps in later, I'll let them in and they can just get caught up. So my name is Magdalena Sturman. I'm one of the administrators at the Brinton 1704 House. And this is our last virtual program of the year. I wanted to end with Ellen Starr Brinton because not only is she a very famous and influential member of the Brinton family. She's local to the area where our museum is, but also because 2020 marks 100 years of women having the right to vote in the United States. And Ellen Brinton was part of that first generation of women that were able to vote with the passing of that amendment. So I thought it'd be nice to kind of end this historic year with a discussion about her life. And if anyone came on a little later and didn't hear, I think we have a few direct relatives of Ellen Starr Brinton on the meeting today. So I'll go through, I would just ask once we get started with the slideshow and everything, if everyone could just mute themselves just so that we don't have any background noise. And then at the end of the presentation, we can have a quick Q&A. If there are resources that you guys are looking for in terms of, I know a lot of people have started family genealogy projects while we've all been kind of locked down and things like that. Let me know in the chat, or you can also send an email through the website or contact us on Facebook or Instagram. And we have resources available to try and help you guys fill in any of that information that you need.
I heard this is going to be recorded, so will we have access to the recording at another time?
You can get access to the recording. It's a matter of, I am not a technology expert, so I have to figure out how to cut and format the video, and I'll put it up on our YouTube page. And then if you want a copy of the link, I can send a copy to you. But I will say I'm not a technology expert, so it might take a week or two for me to get it up there.
Maybe you can send them to all those of us who attended.
Yeah, absolutely. If everyone's interested, I can certainly
Yes.
send a link.
Share
Okay,
it
great.
with my siblings and so on.
Awesome. Does anybody else have any other questions or anything before we get started? Okay, let's go. I'm going to share my screen so that you guys can see the presentation. Okay. So I know this is not the greatest picture in the world, but this is one of a very few photos we actually have of Ellen Starr Brinton. So she was born in 1886 on a fruit farm in Chester County. She was the only girl in a family of 5 brothers, and her family were birthright members of the Society of Friends, also known as Quakers. And Brinton kept with this religion throughout her entire life, and several tenets of Quakerism, including pacifism and social justice, probably informed a lot of the professional choices she made as an adult. She was a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, and she was part of a very early generation of women who were coming of age at a time when professional careers were becoming an option for them. So I talked about women getting the right to vote, but even more than that, women having a role, a significant role outside the home, was a very new sort of groundbreaking idea in the early 20th century. And she was kind of right on the earliest part of that trend. She was I'm sorry, hold on a second. There we go. She was also very academically gifted, even as a young child, and her education and a lot of her early professional upbringing also honed her organizational and administrative skills. And that's where the Brinton genealogy book comes into play. This photo is of the cover of the 1924 first edition. But the Brinton genealogy was a roughly, I think it's about 750-page book that was created by the Brinton Family Association in the early 20th century as an attempt to record as much information about living members of the family as possible, or information from living members of the family about their ancestors. They hired a local genealogist to compile it, but Ellen Starr Brinton was very heavily involved in its work. And actually the genealogist that they hired to work on it said after the book was published that she was key to its publication, and she held the committee together, faithfully attended all meetings, and was always helpful in supplying any missing material for the book. If it had not been for the intelligent effort, loyalty, and personal sacrifice of Ellen Starr Brinton, this genealogy would probably have never been completed and published. So if anyone is not aware of, some of the basic background of the Brinton family in Chester County, the Brintons were Quakers who moved from England in 1684 to the Chester County area when Pennsylvania colony was very new. And the legacy of the family, the Brinton genealogy covers the legacy of the family stretching back to the earliest roots in England. And of course, then this genealogies are the museum, the 1704 House Museum, owes its existence to the Brinton Family Association that published this Brinton genealogy. If this project didn't get off the ground, the museum probably would not have ended up becoming what it was, and the house would not have been preserved as it was in the mid-20th century. So this book was published in 1924, but it was being worked on since the beginning of the 1900s. And of course, one of the defining moments of the early 20th century was World War I. During World War I, Ellen Starr Brinton was hired by the publicity division of the Philadelphia branch of the Food Administration. So she was responsible for producing posters, pamphlets, recipes, things such as this image here. I don't know for certain that she worked on this, but this is something that came out of her office. The idea behind the food administration during World War I was promoting food conservation amongst the public in order to help the war effort. And they also published recipes for things like meatless meals or wheatless meals to try and preserve some of these sort of high ticket items for soldiers fighting in World War I. The US Food Administration was also concerned with national security regarding food production and conserving the food supply. And it was primarily, in terms of its state and local branches, a volunteer effort that was often mostly run by women. So they would track food receipts, they would track putting up these posters and educating people. And this was something that women really started to get involved in their local community and also take sort of a political and an interest in politics and international affairs as well. And of course, as I mentioned before, it's also helped hone many of their administrative and organizational abilities. It is a little odd sometimes to hear of a Quaker being involved in something like a war effort and something like World War I. But I think people have speculated that for Quakers such as Ellen Starr Brinton, for example, that there was a calculated decision made between the Quaker beliefs in pacifism and Quaker beliefs in community service. And I think for Ellen Starr Brinton, I don't have any hard evidence from her diary or anything like that, but it would appear that her dedication to community service during World War I kind of trumped any pacifist arguments against being involved in any way in the war effort. She also wrote for a Philadelphia area newspaper briefly during the war as well. So following the end of World War I, Brinton, I mentioned the pacifist ideals of Quakerism. Brinton became pretty heavily involved in the anti-war movement that sort of took off during World War I, and then certainly between World War I and World War II, gained a significant international following. She took a job as the field secretary for the Pennsylvania Women's International League for Peace and Freedom branch. I'm sorry, I think somebody is trying to join the meeting. If you just hold on one second, let me let her in. There we go. Okay. So I think to whoever just joined us, we did get started, but I can catch you up. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat and I'll try and get them answered for you. Oh, and I think we have somebody else joining. Sorry, hold on one moment. There we go. Okay, we should be good now. So as I was saying, Ellen Starr Brinton took a job as the field secretary for the Pennsylvania branch of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. So this is the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom's logo. They still exist today. They're a nonprofit, non-governmental organization. And their mission statement is to bring together women of different political views and philosophical and religious backgrounds, determined to study and make known the causes of war and work for a permanent peace. And this organization started in the US as the Women's Peace Party. It developed internationally with the International Women's Congress against World War I. That was held at The Hague in 1915. And this was a congress of women from various countries, all of whom were dedicated to the pacifist effort. It wasn't just to protest World War I in particular, they also discussed diplomatic means of preventing future armed conflicts as well. It did not actually end up being named, if you guys are doing any research on it, it didn't come under the name Women's International League for Peace and Freedom until 1919. Prior to that, mostly you'll find information on it if you look up the International Women's Congress of 1915. And their first president is this woman, Jane Addams. And she founded the Women's Peace Party in the United States, which then just eventually kind of got co-opted into being the US chapter of the International League of Peace and Freedom. Jane Addams was a little bit older than Ellen Starr Brinton. She was about 20 years older. But she and Ellen became pretty close friends and obviously worked together closely as well. And Jane was sort of a mentor to Ellen, as well as somebody that she looked up to. Jane Addams was a suffragist. I'm sorry, guys, hold on one moment. Let me just let someone into the meeting. Let's see. Okay, should be in. So Jane Addams kind of started out cutting her teeth on activism with the women's rights movement. She was a very important suffragist, but she's primarily known in the United States as the mother of the social work profession, and also as one of the 2 founding members of the ACLU, so the American Civil Liberties Union. She was also an author and an activist and a speaker, and she was, at the time, a reform activist in the United States. And primarily she advocated for policies that concerned women, families, children, health and safety, sanitation. And one of the arguments that she frequently made, which kind of turned some of the, I guess, anti-feminist arguments on its head, was that for so long, women have been the keepers of the home and family. So certainly it makes sense then that women should have a say in policies that affect homes and families, sanitation, healthcare, things that were stereotypically, assigned to the women's role within the home. And she vocally brought them, women's involvement in these issues into the public sphere as well, politically. She was a speaker at the International Women's Conference in 1915, and apparently made quite an impression as an orator. I'm sorry, there's somebody else joining the meeting. Give me one moment.
This is Carol. She founded Hull House, didn't she, in Chicago?
In Chicago, yes, she did. Sorry, I'm not sure if this person got in. I'm sorry, guys, give me one moment. Yep, we're good. Okay. So following her speaking engagement at the International Women's Conference, a woman named Emily Balk, who was also a pacifist and who attended the conference, said, "Ms. Addams shines so respectful of everyone's views, so eager to understand and sympathize, so patient of anarchy and even ego, yet always there, strong, wise, and in the lead. No managing, no keeping dark and bringing things subtly to pass, just irradiating wisdom and power of judgment." And this is, like I said, this is the woman who was Ellen Starr Brinton's mentor. They worked very closely together. And these are all certainly qualities that then Ellen Starr Brinton started incorporating into her professional life as well. And Jane Addams was eventually awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. She was the first American woman to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. This is one of the very few candid shots I was able to find of Ellen Starr Brinton. So if you guys can all see, this is her right here in the back, standing behind Jingo the dinosaur. This was a Women's International League of Peace and Freedom protest held in Philadelphia in 1935. And the dinosaur is meant to represent the idea of war needing to become extinct. And he was named Jingo after jingoism, that sort of extreme patriotism that's usually whipped into a frenzy around warfare. But I think this is actually the only candid shot I was able to find of her, but that is Ellen Starr Brinton standing there to the right in the back. All right. So as part of her professional training and part of her involvement in the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, Ellen Starr Brinton also ended up becoming involved in something of a turf war between the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom and Daughters of the American Revolution. So surrounding World War I, members of the people who spoke at the International Women's Peace Conference at The Hague, members of the Women's Peace Party, took a pacifist perspective on World War I, and they were trying to end involvement in the war, and they argued strongly for mediation and diplomatic dialogue to end international conflicts. Daughters of the American Revolution, on the other hand, argued that action was necessary to ensure an American victory in the war. So it wasn't the idea that they wanted the US to stay out of the war, they wanted the US to win the war. So the Daughters of the American Revolution did things like purchasing war bonds, they made donations to relief charities, and they provided items to soldiers and sailors overseas, and essentially ended up taking on a political role that DAR had never really taken on before to such a scale in such an international and public sphere. And of course, the contrast between the two organizations then led to something of a conflict. Daughters of the American Revolution published several articles that accused the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom of being unpatriotic because of their opposition to the war. And Starr Brinton, presumably for her writing and persuasive abilities, something that she probably started developing while she was working for the Food Administration, was supposed to spearhead and coordinate the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom's response to the DAR's attack, which she did fairly bitingly, including a pretty sharp critique of Daughters of the American Revolution's admissions policy, which she considered racist. At the time, they would not accept any women into membership who are not white. So this was, it's not the world's largest conflict surrounding World War I, certainly political conflict, but it was an interesting contrast of two very politically active, heavily involved women's groups that ended up in direct conflict with one another over this sort of ideological, philosophical basis. After the end of World War I, Starr Brinton started working more internationally with the Women's League. She had primarily just been based in Philadelphia beforehand, but by the 1930s, she had traveled a lot to Latin America and Europe and started developing her own international network of fellow peace activists. She argued against violence in Cuba and against US intervention in Cuban affairs. And during her trips to Latin America, she cultivated a network of connections for the United States-based chapter of the agency, and trying to expand that to develop more of an international coalition. She was very widely known, at least in the Philadelphia area, as a public lecturer. She did mostly seem to speak at like Young Women's Christian Movement speaking engagements. She was mostly speaking to women, it seems like, which is probably a reflection of attitudes at the time. But even in the Philadelphia Inquirer, she was noted as being an expert on war and peace due to firsthand experience and her international travel. So as part of all of this international travel, she ends up attending peace conferences in Europe throughout the 1930s. And these peace conferences, at first, are mostly to do with World War I and the aftermath of World War I. And as a matter of fact, as intelligent as she was, she did make a few terrible predictions. She spoke to a newspaper in 1932 following a visit to a peace conference in Germany, saying that the, quote, Hitlerite movement she noted that it was well managed, but mostly provided only an outlet for young people to have something to do, and that most serious people did not take it very seriously at all. So she was a little bit dismissive of that, and she oddly did support Mussolini for a very brief period of time. She said that she thought that he had done a great deal to help organize the country. She did eventually change these opinions, but it was kind of an interesting early 1930s perspective on things, particularly the lack of seriousness with which she regarded Hitler's rise to power. Around the same time, and in part kind of connected to her trips to Europe, Brinton was appointed the first curator of Swarthmore University's Peace Collection. So in 1935, she got this post. And it was a little strange for her to have been appointed. She had no formal archival training, but she was a very well-known Quaker pacifist in the local area. So I think to a certain extent, it made a logical choice. Swarthmore University was a women's college. So she ended up taking an archival management course at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. She said in a personal letter that she felt completely unprepared to take on the job and knew she needed to get herself some training and some help. But she actually, despite having no formal training and despite this being a part-time job at first, she really seemed to excel, particularly at collecting important writings of her contemporaries and her fellow activists, probably because of her familiarity with them and their writing. And she actually managed to obtain the bulk of Jane Addams's private writings for the Peace Collection, which now actually sort of forms the basis for the entire organization. They are still there. Swarthmore is not currently allowing any research appointments, but if you guys do want to email and ask, there's a finding aid online, and they're trying to scan documents as quickly as possible and digitize them. So I can also, if you guys want the information for that, I can put that in the chat as well, if you guys are looking for some more family information. So as part of her travel to collect writings from peace activists for Swarthmore University, she, in 1937, went back to Germany, to Cologne, for another European Peace Conference. But it was also in part because she wanted to collect the personal writings of Ludwig, and I'm going to butcher his last name. I think it's pronounced Kveda, who was a Nobel Peace Laureate, and he was the former head of the German Peace Society. And he had fled to Switzerland in 1933 following Hitler's rise to power. And at this point, by the early 1930s, mid-1930s, it was becoming pretty dangerous to be involved with the German Peace Society or other pacifist movements in Germany. Ludwig Kveda, sorry, this is his image here. I know I skipped ahead a slide earlier on. But he had, in 1918, spoken for the German Peace Society regarding the outcome of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. And he said, a humiliated and torn German nation condemned to economic misery would be a constant danger to world peace, just as a protected German nation whose inalienable rights and subsistence are safeguarded would be a strong pillar of such world peace. And he was a consistent advocate against what he saw as excessive militarization. And he argued, again, like many of his female contemporaries with the Women's League and other organizations, for diplomatic solutions and against what they saw as excessive technological militarization of European powers. While he was in exile, his personal writings had been seized by the German Gestapo. And part of Brinton's mission, if you will, to Cologne was to attempt to collect those writings for Swarthmore University. And she, knowing that it was an extremely dangerous thing for her to be doing, went with the US consul to the Gestapo headquarters in Cologne to try and convince them to give her Kveda's papers. She didn't end up being successful. The Gestapo held on to the papers throughout the war, and they actually were eventually destroyed by an Allied bombing campaign. But even for an American citizen at the time, it was quite dangerous in 1937 to be meeting with the German activists that she was meeting with, and to be advocating the kinds of policies that she was advocating. And she kept a personal travel diary that actually is not all that informational from that trip. And that's primarily because she was self-censoring to prevent anyone, not trying to put in any identifying information, not naming any names of any of these German peace activists that she was working with and meeting with. So it was a little bit on the seditious side and certainly a little bit on the dangerous side. And I know this is one of the scanned documents that I was able to get from Swarthmore University from Starr Brinton's personal correspondence. If you guys can't read it, unfortunately, there's not a lot I can do to sharpen the image, but I could send you a copy of it if you guys would like to look at it a little bit more closely. But this is a copy of a letter to Ellen Starr Brinton from Ella Kolka. And the Kolkas were a Czechoslovakian Jewish family that Brinton became friends with during this 1937 European trip that she did. She became close friends with 4 of the women in the family, starting with Rosa Kolka, who was a local Czechoslovakian leader in the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. But as, of course, you know, tensions are rising up toward and into the beginning of World War II, it became extremely dangerous for these sort of labeled by the government, seditious activists. And so Brinton began a campaign once she was back home in the United States to try and get Rosa Kolka, her sister Julia, and their 2 young nieces, Ella and Susie, to escape to the United States as political refugees. Julia and Rosa, most of these letters are in Swarthmore University's collection. This was just one of the few that they have digitized right now. Otherwise, I'd have a lot more for you guys to look at. But Julia and Rosa in the letters come across as far more concerned with their niece's safety than their own. And Brinton was writing letters back and forth, trying to keep their spirits up, trying to encourage them, but also offering them her home in Narberth to stay in if they were able to get to the United States. And throughout the late 1930s into the beginning of World War II, she was pretty heavily working her international network of contacts to try and figure out a way to get the Kolkas and other refugees to the United States. She actually even got a US Senator, Henry Cabot Lodge, to advocate for her cause. She apparently pestered the living daylights out of the State Department, but there were a few structural barriers, including very specific United States immigration quotas regarding Jews and East Europeans coming into the United States as refugees, and a very complicated State Department bureaucracy that she was not able to get her motion through, and she was unable to get them out of Czechoslovakia. She continued writing to them. I'm sorry, hold on one moment. Somebody else is joining. Let's see if I can get them in. Whoop. I'm sorry, everyone. There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. So like I said, she ultimately was not able to get the Kolka family to safety in the United States. She did continue writing to them. She continued to try and use her contacts and her political influence to get them here, and of course to help other refugees as well. She just was unsuccessful. And by 1941, the letters started coming back unanswered. She did not find out what happened to them until 1946, when a relief worker in Czechoslovakia replied to a Red Cross telegram that she had sent. They were eventually able to track down what happened to the family. So the Red Cross worker responded to Brinton's inquiry saying, "The results of my investigation were sad. Rosa Kolka died in the concentration camp in Terezin. Julia Kolka and her niece Ella were moved from Terezin to Poland into the district of Lublin. And what that meant, we by now know only too well. They have not returned. It is also dreadful. We have lost so many good friends and we miss them very much." So there was no mention of Susie, but the family assumed that she had probably been with her cousin and was killed in a concentration camp. Probably could be either due to their status as sort of seditious political activists, probably also had something to do with the fact that they were a Jewish family. This friendship and this effort had obviously touched Ellen Starr Brinton very much. She kept a small portrait of one of the girls, Ella, and all of the collected correspondence from this effort together in her personal papers for the rest of her life. And then it's now become part of the Swarthmore Peace Collection as well. So it's one very small story, but it's certainly very representative of a lot of the work that she did during World War II, aiding the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom and the Red Cross, trying to help get refugees who are fleeing persecution in Europe into the United States. And it's very unfortunate that this one story, as of course so many of them did not have a happy ending. Ellen Starr Brinton continued to work for the Swarthmore Peace Collection as a curator up through 1951. She then retired, but it was sort of a semi-retirement. She continued to publish a number of papers and scholarly articles. One of the key things that she got later on for the collection in her role as curator was information surrounding the Lenape Native Americans during the very early colonial era. So that's also available if you want to look through Swarthmore University's finding aid. Some of those papers have been digitized, but that's a bulk of the collection that she contributed to their archives as well. She also helped to fund the Fellowship House in Media, Pennsylvania, the mission of which is promoting interracial understanding following an incident in Media where 2 African-American women were denied service at a diner because of their race. So a good portion after her death of her foundation was donated to the organization that she had helped found to try and help expand it. Ellen Starr Brinton died on July 2nd, 1954. She did not marry and she didn't have children, which is actually another aspect of her life that was very unusual. She was financially independent. She never felt the need to get married for personal or financial security, which again was something that was fairly unusual at the time. And her life's work is preserved in that piece collection. There's not a lot of personal information there. Like I said, a lot of her diary entries are pretty heavily self-censored to try and avoid implicating anyone. So she's sort of, in terms of getting information about her and her life and her personal thoughts, it's a lot of reading in between the lines. But I think if you guys are able to, or interested in, especially for people on the call who are related to her, I would definitely recommend checking out the Peace Collection's finding aid and seeing if you can get them to send you some of the digitized documents that they're working on right now. Because these personal letters to the Kulkas are really where a lot of her private thoughts and personal and emotional relationships come out and are seen much more so than a lot of her other collected works. Do you guys have, like I said, we'll do a Q&A at the end. Let me turn off my screen share here. And there we go. Does anybody have any questions that you would like to ask? If you raise your hand in your video, or you can raise your hand on Zoom and then unmute yourself. Carol, if you want to go ahead.
It's not a question. I went to the Swarthmore Peace Collection when I went to my Westtown 50th reunion some years ago. Mm-hmm. And I remember reading something in there that she had a relationship with a gentleman who was an ambulance driver in China during one of the wars. And there were no details, but it said she did have a relationship with somebody, with a man who was in China.
Yeah, so that I from the quote that I saw from that letter, that was a close friend of hers who I believe died during World War II. Mm-hmm. I would have to look it up again, but it was one of those things that was sort of sounded a little speculative, as if to, whether it was, just a very close friendship or if it was something more than that. Yeah. But yes, I'm not sure if that is a personal letter of hers that's in the collection, or if that's something that the now I can't remember her name, but one of the curators now of the piece collection, she's actually retiring this year, published an academic paper in 1998 on Ellen Starr Brinton. And I think the quote may have been included in there, but I could certainly hunt that down and look that up for you if you wanted some more information on that.
Not a big deal, but I just remember reading that and saying, yes, she had a close friend who was a male, which we didn't hear much about.
Yeah, that was that's one of those things where I think it was a close friendship. It could have been something more, but she definitely never married and she never had children.
Right.
I think I saw somebody else's hand up. Tom, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Thank you. So as I put in the chat box, Ellen was my mother's guardian and adopted her when my mother was about 11. I would have been about 1941. So although she didn't have children, she was a very profound influence on my mother and really raised her, sent her to college, and my mom eventually inherited her house. I do have some of her things, perhaps that's a topic for another time, but the things that the resources, her passports, Ellen's passports make very interesting reading.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, the documents from that time are, as you can imagine, the visas and stuff, that they're really fascinating to look at. I was wondering if you know anything about Ellen's early family life. I don't remember my mom hearing, she was obviously involved in the Brinton family, but I don't remember too much about siblings or what her parents were like or anything like that.
Yeah, I wasn't able to turn up a whole lot of information. There is a section on her in the Brinton genealogy that she helped write. So I know her parents owned a farm in rural Chester County that was primarily raising fruit. She had 5 brothers. She was the only daughter. And that she certainly grew up in the local area. As far as I know, I don't even have information as to where she went to like primary, secondary school. I know she graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, but I couldn't find any records of, did she attend Westtown or, she probably went to a Quaker school would be my guess, because her family were birthright friends. And that was fairly common practice for children to attend, a school associated with their faith. But I couldn't give you any more information beyond that, unfortunately, because I think that Brinton genealogy is the only place I found early life information about her. Carol?
Thank you.
It's me again. I believe her brother, Clement Starr Brinton, who was my grandfather, I think he went to Westtown School. And my grandmother, Retta Hoops Brinton, also went there. So I'll bet she went to Westtown School, and maybe we could get in touch with Westtown to see if they've got graduation.
Yeah, we might be able to hunt out. And I wonder too, I'm not sure if University of Pennsylvania would have kept this information, but maybe there might be information like that on her like application or her acceptance paper, or some kind of records there as well. But yeah, unfortunately, there just does not seem to be a lot of published information about her early life beyond that. Did anybody else have any questions, any comments?
I'd like to know if Fellowship House is still in existence.
I believe it is. And let me see if I can find their website for you. I can put it in the chat. Oh, that's not what I'm looking for. Sorry. 1 second. Here it is. I'm going to put the I'm going to put the website for it in the chat right here. Come on.
It would be nice to donate to them in her memory.
They do have a donate button very prominently on their website. So if you guys are able to, everything that's in the chat right now will go away once I end the meeting. So if there's any information that you wanted from it, if you want to pull that out now, including that website. And I see Jackie asked a question, was the peace job her only paid job ever? No, it was not. So she was a journalist for a Philly newspaper briefly during World War I. And she worked for the Food Administration in their educational, what's the word I'm looking for? marketing division during World War I, helping organize food rations and things like that. That, and then of course her work with the Swarthmore Peace Collection with the I believe it's called the Jane Addams Collection now. She was paid for all of her work there. But the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom was probably the most high profile job she had. It involved a lot of travel, and it certainly involved her meeting with a number of people all over the globe and building sort of this vast coalition network of pacifists around the globe. And I see another question. Let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. Are copies of the 1924 Brinton genealogy book available anywhere that you know of? Yes, the Brinton 1704 house has copies of the genealogy, and let me get a link to that in the chat. I think there are also some first edition copies on eBay, but we do carry the, come on, where is it? There we go. But we carry the reprint. There's also, if you guys, again, are doing some family genealogy research, here we go. Here's the link to our shop. Right now, our online shop does not list the quote unquote like green book, that copy that I showed you. But I think we have copies somewhere in the office. So if you want to send us an email, if you're looking for that specific one, we should be able to, I think we should be able to hunt down a copy for you. Let's see. Let's see. I'm sorry, the chat is not cooperating. I think so. What was the source of that income? Her parents. So like I said, she did have paid jobs, and she didn't end up, I think what I meant, and maybe I said it incorrectly. She never had to marry for financial reasons. So that was something that was kind of unusual. Again, she was part of that sort of early wave of 20th century women who were able to go into a professional career. So she was herself independent, financially independent. But her parents were not wealthy. They were middle-class farmers in rural Chester County. They were not, you know, it wasn't the Rockefellers or anything like that. But I think most of her financial independence really came from the fact that she was able to hold the professional jobs she had throughout her career. Let's see. Oh, and Constance just last, yes, I will be sending out a link from the video if you guys would like to rewatch it, or if you joined a little later and wanted to jump on. Like I said, that might take me a week or two to cut it and actually get it on YouTube. Does anyone else have any questions that they didn't manage to get in the chat? Oh, I see Sylvia raising your hand. Sylvia, hold on one second. I think you're muted. I'm going to send a request for you to unmute yourself. No.
Okay, sorry.
There we go. No, that's okay.
She got her job with the Food and Drug Administration because her brother, my grandfather, Clement, went to Washington and helped found that. And
Yes,
very
yeah.
close to her brothers and loved living on the farm just outside of Westchester, and was very upset when that farm had to be sold after her youngest brother died. But the person we thought of as her lover was killed on the Burma Road. Apparently, that was the story we were told. And so that was a great tragedy. But she started working, I think, first because her brother helped her with the Food and Drug Administration job. And then she also was very active in the library because that's what she loved. She was a very strong woman and ferocious, and to kids. She knew just where she stood and where we should stand too. So, very, very hard in a way. When I was trying to learn to ride a little pony, she just chastised me for not knowing better how to do it. So there was that side of her, and that was her strength. And yet at the same time, when we were one summer at the Army, the summer that the Japanese, the Second World War was over, we lived with her on that farm that summer. And my brother got very sick, and she did not want to call the doctor. She just wanted to use a mustard plaster. So I mean, there was that very fierce, lovely side of her that was also very difficult for children. So it may have been just as well that she worked on a larger scale.
Right, right, rather than one-on-one.
Right.
And then, Carol, it sounds like that family story might answer your question that you had earlier about.
Yeah, right, about her relationship with somebody in the Far East. Also, Sylvia is Ellen's and my sister. So I remember, is that Uncle Rob's farm?
Yeah,
farm?
Ormead, right.
Yeah, I got stuck in the top of the barn for hours. I climbed up the straight ladder, and then there was nothing to hold to get down. So I spent probably half a day up there crying and wondering how to get down from the top of the barn. And then there was a bat in my bedroom once. I remember one night there.
It's wonderful to have, you know, family members on calls like these, because these are certainly stories that we would not have heard about otherwise. I do see a question that I'm going to direct to Carol and Sylvia and Ellen. It sounds like Chris was asking about the location of the farm. I think Ellen Starr Brinton's family farm. Do you guys know, was that Ormead, or was that somewhere else that you guys were talking about?
It was called the Lindens. And you could see Ormead across from the top of the barn, across to Ormead. Uncle Frank lived at Ormead. He was, right, Frank Brinton and his wife. But, and Frank was, I think Frank was second in that line of kids.
Yeah, he was the antique dealer. Yeah.
Okay, so he and his wife Deborah were the couple who helped create the 1704 house.
Right.
If anyone wasn't connecting the family dots there. So Chris.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
He collected antiques.
Yes, and actually, I'm not sure how many of you guys have visited the 1704 house, but a lot of our collection of antique furniture is from Francis and Deborah Brinton's personal collection. They apparently, when they were setting up the 1704 house and getting the conservation work done on it, they were setting aside some of their favorite pieces that they had acquired over a career of antique dealing, and those are now part of the Brinton Family Association's collection. So once the pandemic ends, if anyone would like to come and visit and see some of those, of course, you'd be more than welcome. So Chris, did that kind of answer your question? Oh, I think Chris is muted. I think that answered it. Okay.
Yes, although I would like to know what road it is. Is that on Brinton's Bridge Road, or where is that? Where was the farm?
It was a very was an original piece of a rectangular farm set out quite early, and I don't know the name of the road, but I think it was I was told it was 5 miles out of Westchester, because they had to walk into Westchester to school every day.
Woo.
And maybe it wasn't 5 miles. I never actually, but we were told they were very rugged kids.
I think you'd have to be with a hike like that. And then I also saw somebody asked about the genealogy and the 1998 supplement. I think we still have copies in the office, but if you want to, I'll put my work email address in the chat. I will check when I'm there on Monday and see if we actually have any copies in stock right now. So you can go ahead and email there if you're interested in trying to buy another copy. I can't promise we have any, but if we do, I will let you know. Does anybody else have any other questions? Oh, Susan, go ahead.
Oh, let's see.
Susan, I think you muted yourself actually.
I thought it was.
There we go. That's better. We can hear you now. Yeah.
I met Ellen only twice that I remember. My father was Thomas Stubbs from Westchester, I think my middle name is Brinton. I believe it was my great grandmother on my father's side is the connection. And but I remember Ellen came to visit us. I grew up in Moorestown, New Jersey, because of the Quaker school that went all the way to 12th grade. And I just remember her as she was obviously older in 1954 when she died. I would have been 13. So I was probably about 8 or 9, I'm guessing, when I met her. And to me, she was sort of magical. She was this woman who just appeared and she brought me a little wooden bird whistle. That it was just a little piece of wood and you twisted a screw and it sounded like a bird call, sort of. And I just thought that was magical. And I'd go around the yard after she left, twisting my little bird whistle and trying to attract birds. And then once I visited her at the house in Narberth, I guess it was. And I always think the word magical, I mean, it was just like a sweet little cozy house in the woods. And she took me down. It was on a hill, as I recall. And she took me down to a little stream at the bottom and we picked watercress and had it for lunch. And I couldn't believe it. I just thought it was entrancing. So I had no idea about all her activities. I just saw her as this charming, magical older woman who was so much fun to talk to. And I remember the house, it was so inviting and so cozy, pretty warm colors and just a delight. So.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you everyone so much for sharing those personal stories, because like I said, you know, we get a pretty clear idea of what her professional career was like, but it's much harder with the papers that are left in the collection to get those personal moments and what she was really like as an individual. But thank you so much for sharing. And I thought I heard someone else with maybe another comment. Did someone else have something to say?
I have a
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Carol.
Tom Bottern or Botern, how do you pronounce your name?
Tom.
Bottern.
Bottern.
Yes.
What sort of a collection do you have of her things? I'm curious. You said you have some of her passports?
Yeah, so my mother died a couple of years ago and I still haven't completely sorted through some of her things, but included in that was she held on to all, you know, being an inveterate traveler, all the passports that she could get her hands on, including Ellen's. I also have, I mean, and again, haven't looked at everything. I know I have Ellen's will. My mother was her executor. And then I have her correspondence with my mother from about 1950 to 54. My mother traveled through Europe working with a lot of friends organizations there, and mainly using Ellen's contacts, I think, to meet a lot of these people. So they had this, you know, at that time, of course, that was how you communicated. And I have a little sheaf of letters from that period of time. And there may be a few other things floating around as well.
It's amazing. And then I saw Patricia Ann Brinton. You're related to Robert Brinton, it sounds like, from the note you wrote. Are you still there, Patricia?
Oh, she is muted.
Her picture's there, but
I'm still here. We're from Minnesota, however. So I heard you mention a Robert Brinton. We're from Minnesota.
Oh, from the note you put on there, you said you were related to Robert Brinton.
Correct.
In the chat.
Correct. But we're from Minnesota.
Okay.
My father was born in North Dakota and then moved to Minnesota. His father was Harry Masters Brinton.
So I misunderstood maybe your note in the chat box.
Well, I know that you mentioned a Robert Brinton, but it's a different one.
Okay, all right.
Well, does anybody else have any other questions? I just want to remind everyone the chat will disappear when we end the call. So if there is any information you want to get off there,